Welcome back to another segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons. Today, I am welcoming back John Dayton, who has been so wonderful in the past, answering some of your questions that were a little more technically involved than I could answer. So please welcome back John Dayton. Hello. So nice to have
Good
you join
evening.
us again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
I can start with some of the questions I've accumulated from people regarding the Waltons, if
Okay.
that works for you.
Huh?
Okay. So, one of the questions is about writers and directors, like how were writers assigned to scripts over the course of a season? Were they given a concept? Did they come up with a concept? Kind of how that worked. And then, sort of the same thing with directors. Did directors get to choose what episodes they directed, or were they assigned?
It was all based on scheduling. Um, for example, and the deal that would be made with the director. So maybe at the beginning of the season we had what? How many did we do in a season?
About
Yeah.
24. Yeah.
Okay,
24,
20,
25.
24. So of those 24, then maybe Harry would direct, 6. This would be agreed on in the beginning. Harry would direct 6, Ralph would direct 3, Sinensky would direct 2. All of that those decisions were made ahead of time. Scripts were not always available. In other words, we didn't have 24 scripts, prepared, and then the directors could choose. I remember Sinensky telling me same thing was true on Star Trek. He had signed up for a couple episodes and got assigned to an episode that he really liked the script, and then he got switched off to another script. Who knows what the reason was, but it could have been rewritten but basically that was where we were. Rod and Claire, of course, um, Rod Peterson and Claire Whitaker. For example, when Ellen had her stroke, suddenly rewrites had to be made. And then when negotiations were made with CBS to go ahead and face the problem head on, then Rod and Claire wrote that wonderful script, Grandma Comes Home. Anyway, no, we did not have 24 scripts ready to go.
Right.
And obviously, as I keep saying over and over again, Earl went through those scripts before to approve them. So, and oftentimes, Earl would make changes and not take credit.
Right.
So, and sometimes those were a few lines, but sometimes those were uh, fairly comprehensive rewrites. But the show basically was Earl.
Okay. I mean, my take on it was, this is just my guess from what I would see on when we would get a list of episodes for the season, and there'd be
Yeah,
a lot of to be announced, a lot of TBA on the sometimes the script title, sometimes the director.
yeah,
And because I know that some of the episodes were based on real, loosely on incidents from Earl's
Earl's, yeah,
childhood, and some I think were far more just fictitious. My understanding from Claire and from Rod and Claire was that the Ferris wheel was an episode that came to Claire in a dream. She like woke
yes.
up with this idea and pitched it.
Mhm.
So my sense was that there were some episodes, if they had writers that they either like directors contracted at the beginning of the season, that
Yes.
some of them might be ideas that Earl had that they wrote, and some might be concepts that they pitched that were then approved and they
Mhm.
wrote. So I don't know, maybe I'm just guessing there, but that
No,
was
well, and I'm guessing part of it
okay.
because really, it wasn't my job to be in the production office going over scripts, but I constantly give the credit to Earl
Yeah.
and for how the show morphed into what it became to be. This wonderful show that no one else has done before.
Yeah. I know recently when we did the Hollywood Museum, in a couple of cases, Michael has talked about how they would have the table reads that pretty much just she, Ralph, and Richard, and Will and Ellen would attend, which made sense.
Yeah.
And Michael talked about them sort of going to bat to early in the season, and also to maintain the integrity of the show, because they could speak on behalf of all of the characters from the inside to say, this feels real, or this feels too sentimental, or that they would fight to try and improve the scripts based on that table read. And I think that oftentimes actors they certainly know their character better than the writers do. I really appreciated that they cared enough to want to make it as good as possible.
I think that, well, on other shows I've worked on, it depends on the producers and somewhat the writers to allow actors to make suggestions or make changes. And I believe the attitude, the whole atmosphere of the show. I don't know, did you ever feel like you couldn't make a suggestion?
Yes and no. I mean, I think we made them, but they were frequently just brushed off, particularly in later seasons. I also understand you had Richard, not so much a child, but we had 6 children. Yeah. So it could have easily gotten completely out of hand. We put our foot down when directors wanted to change our seating at the kitchen table. Right. We were like, no, this is where I sit. And most of the time we won that, but not always. And in later seasons, it changed a bit. It wasn't that I didn't feel like I could say things, but I know in earlier seasons, it was far more likely that if something was awkward, not just like me saying, oh, I really don't want to say it this way, but if a scene just was awkward or something felt really inconsistent with something else in the episode, that it was a little easier to make some adjustments in the earlier seasons. And then it got much tougher. My understanding was because everything had to go through the network later on. So things weren't allowed to be changed without network approval. I don't know if that's true, but I know we started hearing that there was more and more approvals needed from network, where early on they gave Lorimar a lot more free rein on, I think, casting and adjustments with scripts and things like that.
Bringing up that very funny note that came down to the stage where Richard had to say darn, and we got that note. Make sure he says darn and not damn. But later in the season, I noticed there was an episode where he did say damn.
Well, I know I said damn in The Sinner.
Should be damned into it.
Damn!
And I do remember them saying, be very definite that it's just damn.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
That it isn't damn it or, anything else. It had to be very specific to that. And those things I understood. This was a point when there was still more censorship in television, and I'm not sorry that we were in that era.
So I have another question for you. So the blocking,
right?
And maybe you can explain how that went.
Usually we were all called in, and the director often would have some idea of kind of what he wanted. And I mean, it depended on the director. Some directors were like, okay, you'll be over here. You're over at the kitchen and you're at the table, and, you're going to bring something to the table. And so they'd kind of have an idea about that, particularly if there was a fair number of people, or if we were all in the living room or something. They would typically place us, and a lot of it was based upon the flow of the dialogue sometimes, because the camera could then, we want you two together because we can pick up a 2-shot there, or we want to pan around and pick up dialogue. But if it was just a 2-person scene or something, then it might be a little looser. But any additional movement that went on would be worked out because that meant where the camera was going to be. So a lot of times the director would go, okay, I want, everyone's going to come in, they're going to sit around the table, grandma's going to bring something to the table, mama's going to bring something to the table, and everybody's going to sit down. And then, the conversation would happen between the director and, of course, any crew involved were watching that. And then once it was figured out, great, okay, so we're going to throw the camera here, and then they'd send us all away. So it was pretty loose. Marks would be taken before they sent us away. Okay, you're starting there. Mark Michael at the stove, Mark Ellen at the butcher block. And then, and then they'd figure out where they were going to put the camera, and we'd go away while they did the lighting.
So here's another question. How did you hit your marks without looking down for them?
A couple of different things. One is I relied a lot on peripheral vision, where I could see the mark from further away, and then I just kind of like keep a spatial sense of that as I walked forward to that point. And you sort of triangulate where that spot is because you've stood there. Mm-hmm. So you sort of know where you are in relation to either other people or other things within the set. So it was a lot of that kind of thing because you were usually in relation to something else. I know we occasionally used sandbags if we were outside. We certainly used them for vehicles arriving.
That's right. So they stopped.
That was too hard to gauge where you needed to be. Yeah, you just kind of learn to, sort of let your vision do that on your way, but not look down right before you step on it. And sometimes you didn't quite make it. And you could feel where the camera was because you could also see a lot of times where the camera was. So you could tell if you were supposed to clear something so that you weren't standing behind a person or someone. You could feel where the camera was.
But that takes experience, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. That being able to feel the light, because the lights were hot enough that you could feel the heat of the light, and you could tell, when you were in the brighter light, and certainly clearing people. But the other tricky thing was always avoiding looking at the camera, no matter how close 5 heads were around the camera, to just look at the people and just ignore that camera, even when you were doing a really intense emotional scene and it was, 3 feet in front of you.
Sure.
And the person was standing there, and you had, a camera crew around it, and you had the director sitting over there, and you had a whole bunch of people, and you just kind of you learn to just focus on what you're doing and tune everything else out.
I think another thing I admire about actors is their ability to blank all that out that's behind the camera and perform.
Yeah.
And also with those, the cameras weren't that small in those.
And things were moving, and you had to gauge if the camera was moving, how fast or slow you moved in relation to the camera.
And you've got a boom over the top of your head.
Yeah.
I know we use wireless sometimes, but not inside so much.
Not inside, no. And then sometimes you'd have them right underneath you, so you'd come in. So you've got a camera right there, and you've got people all in your eyesight, and you got some boom just out of camera range. So that's like right underneath you doing whatever it's doing. It really is an exercise in focus.
And then the lines, you have to know the lines. You can't fluff the lines. And also the fact that it required more light. And as you said, hot lights. Yeah. I got a kick out of, there were a couple episodes, and I'm sorry, I can't remember one. They were at night. I believe we shot day for night. And you would see behind you guys this smoke going by. And that was from the arcs that were burning.
Oh, wow.
And you'll see, if fans might be interested in looking at that, it's those days are gone.
Yeah.
We don't use arcs anymore. And my God, they were dangerous and they were heavy. And the electricity that was required was excessive.
Yeah. Willie Ames talked about that when I spoke with him about the smell of the set because of things like those arc lights and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Just
and that was for me. It was fun. It was smell the odors. It was part of it again. Part of the magic.
Yeah.
To see, in fact, you can look at any show that was shot back in those days, or even earlier, back 30s, 40s, 50s, and you'll see that arc smoke in the background. I don't know why anybody didn't think about putting fans up or something.
Noise.
Oh, yes.
That's what I have for you for this segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons in a different sort of an Ask Judy segment. I'll see you next time for more Behind the Scenes of the Waltons and more Ask Judy. Thanks for watching.